Okay, let's get to our guest tonight. Our guest tonight is a gentleman by the name of Michael A. Hoffman. He is the author of a recent history book entitled They Were White and They Were Slaves. It's the untold story of the enslavement of white people in early America. Mr. Hoffman was educated at Oswego State Teachers College and Hobart College. He is a former reporter for the Albany and Buffalo, New York bureaus of the Associated Press and a former director of the Institute for Historical Review. He is the author of 3 other books, by the way, and has published also a bi-monthly history newsletter entitled Revisionist Researcher. And Mr. Hoffman, are you with us tonight?
Yes, I am.
Appreciate you being with us tonight. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Good. Well, you've done magnificent work on a book that, as I don't have to tell you, is not politically correct.
That's right. It isn't at all.
How's it being received out there?
Well, it's being received as sort of a samizdat publication. People are ordering it through bookstores, and there's a growing audience for it. We've sold several thousand copies, and I think that the more publicity that it gets, eventually the audience will grow nationwide and worldwide, God willing.
Well, let's start talking about it. I got some questions to ask you. Now, we've been told that black people have been enslaved and oppressed in America for 400 years, and that the American people need to make reparations to blacks. Perhaps sometimes it's suggested cash payments. And as a result, they're saying of this black enslavement, that's the least we can do. Now, you've written a book claiming that it was the white people who were actually the first slaves in America. So who owes who, Mr. Hoffman?
Well, white people don't owe anyone, Pastor Peters. The fact of the matter is that white youth today are taught that black slaves and Mexicans and Chinese built this country, while the vast majority of the whites lorded it over them with a whiplash in one hand, and a mint julep in the other. But the documentary record tells a very different story. Up to 1/2 of all the arrivals in the American colonies were white slaves, and they were America's first slaves. These whites were slaves for life long before blacks ever were. And this white slavery was even hereditary. White children were born to white slaves, and they were also enslaved. Whites were auctioned on a block with children sold and separated from their parents. Wives were sold and separated from their husbands. Meanwhile, you had free black property owners walking the streets of northern and southern American cities, while white slaves were being worked to death in the sugar mills of Barbados and Jamaica in the West Indies and in the tobacco plantations of Virginia. So the establishment has created this misnomer of indentured servitude to explain away and minimize the fact of white slavery. But if you really read even the establishment historians, if you read their footnotes, even they have to concede, at the very least in the 17th century, that black slavery was almost non-existent and that whites were the overwhelming majority of slaves in America in the 17th century.
Where does the word slave itself come from? Isn't it exclusively in reference to the experience of black people in bondage?
No, it isn't, Pastor Peters. Actually, the word slave derives from the white nation of people known as the Slavs, or the Slavic people. And they were enslaved longer than the entire history of the United States. The Slavic people were slaves about twice as long as blacks were slaves in North America. So the actual definition of that word pertains to the experience of white people in bondage, yet the politically correct historians tell us that we're not allowed to refer to whites as slaves. So it's really a huckster's game that's at work there.
It's that old wordsmith game, isn't it?
That's correct.
How did the enslavement of whites in America begin, anyway?
Well, the enslavement of whites in America really actually has its roots in Great Britain, because it's really a very complex story. Of course, the history of whites in bondage goes all the way back to the ancient world, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, of course, held slaves, and the majority of those slaves were whites. This has pretty much been the essential experience of all people throughout time, and it's ludicrous to say that it's exclusively the experience of blacks. However, if we bring this up to the American colonial period, we must go to Britain because, of course, America was a colony of Britain. And Britain began its decline in the 16th century, shortly after the reign of Henry VIII. It really, I would say, it went into decline under his son, the very weak boy king, Edward VI. And in the era of Edward VI, we see that usury, or the charging of interest on loans, that had been illegal in Britain. And during the reign of Edward VI, he was being manipulated by his counselors, and that's when usury was legalized in Britain in 1548. And from that point onward, you also had the beginnings of the Enclosure Laws, which was the taking away of the right of the English people to farm freely in these common lands which had existed. They were basically swindled out of their land. And from that, you had a pauperization process beginning. You had the first real beginnings of a class of white people in Great Britain known as paupers. And once you had that, of course, you had all the social evils that came along with the paupers. Now, pauperization began in a large-scale way under Queen Elizabeth I, and this is when you had the first welfare laws in Britain being passed. And when white people who had formerly been yeomen, who had been freemen, now there had been a class of white slaves in early Britain known as the villains, from which we get the disparaging term of villain. It was spelled a little bit differently with an E on the end instead of an A. However, you still had a majority of the whites able to farm and able to live as free men. Now, more and more, the majority of whites were changing over from free men and yeomen and landholders and farmers over to this class, this formal class of paupers. And that's what began the roots of white slavery, because once you had paupers, you had developing the workhouse system, which was the way to manage the paupers, which was to enslave them in an institution where they could be controlled, which was the workhouse system in Great Britain.
That's an amazing story. In fact, it's so amazing that I know there are some people just using the understanding cognitive dissonance that they're rejecting some of the things you're saying because it seems so fantastic that they've never heard this. What happened to whites in Great Britain if they opposed the king or they were defeated in battle? You know, in high school today and colleges, we're told that the whites have been so-called indentured servants. We do hear about some indentured servants in America, but never slaves. And I know you address it in the book, and I want you to tell the people about it.
Right. Well, first of all, of course, you had battle captives and people who were opposing the king, or if they lost in battle in the various civil wars and rebellions in Great Britain. Generally, one of their punishments, if they were fortunate enough to escape execution, was enslavement. And what would happen to them is they would be transported. Now, that was in a technical term. It didn't just mean that you were put on a ship, but it was actually a term related to forced deportation from Great Britain. And these various white rebels against the crown were then transported to the British Crown colonies of the West Indies, particularly Barbados and Jamaica, where they were basically worked to death in the sugar mills there. And when white tourists go to Jamaica and Barbados, they're basically going to the scene of a white Holocaust, because most of these white men didn't survive beyond the first couple of years there. However, this enslavement was long-term. It just did not involve only political prisoners or those who had lost battles, but it also involved the kidnapping, as I will discuss later, of whites off the streets of Great Britain, so that even in the early parts of the 20th century, you had a remnant of poor whites in Barbados known as the Redshanks, who were the survivors of white slavery there. So it was a very onerous thing to be captured in battle, and you were, in fact, subject to slavery as a result.
The red shanks, would that in any way tie up with the word rednecks?
Absolutely, yes.
Is that right?
Yes, this is one of the racist terms which the media freely uses. We're often told that the most horrible word, I think this specter was summoned in the O.J. Simpson circus, that the most horrible word in the English language, one of his lawyers said, was the N-word. However, to conscious white people, one of the most horrible words is the word redneck. And this term of derision is bandied about in movies and television and in the newspapers totally blithely. We're just supposed to take this. We're supposed to be labeled in this way. However, if we look at the etymology of the word, the root of it is a means of poking fun at poor white people whose skin would redden in the sun in the West Indies, and they would be called hillbillies, Scotland Johnnies, by blacks and by wealthy whites who enslaved them, red shanks, and eventually this term of derision, this loathsome, contemptible term for poor white people, eventually evolved into the modern-day term of redneck. Yes.
That's fascinating. How were the slaves actually enslaved? How were the whites enslaved if they were not just indentured servants?
Well, the indentured servant thing was basically a racket. I mean, there was a minority of people who were in bondage who were fortunate enough to have been indentured servants, because after all, indentured servitude, when it is practiced correctly and legally, is a form of apprenticeship. Someone, as we were told in high school and college, would trade a period of his labor in return for passage over on a boat or in return for instruction in a skilled trade. So that is a legitimate a contract there between a laborer and an employer, and I certainly sanction it, and I think it's a good thing. In fact, I'd like to see apprenticeship practiced more today as more and more young people get away from the public school systems and they're homeschooled by their parents, and then as they reach their teens, why, it would be quite natural for them to apprentice themselves to a manager or someone who had something to teach them. However, under this euphemism of indentured servitude, Pastor Peters, a tremendous hoax and a tremendous swindle was perpetrated against the poor white people. And that is to say, it functioned in two ways. One, as a cover-up for the actual experience of white people in slavery. In other words, as this slavery grew larger and larger, and the white aristocracy in Britain scrambled for a way to cover it up, they grouped it under the notion of a contract for indenture. Secondly, it functioned as a way of entrapping people. In other words, people would be press-ganged or kidnapped aboard ships, and a spurious indenture would be written out for them, allegedly corresponding to the biblical injunction that no servitude is to go beyond a period of 7 years, and this is where we get the notion of a 7-year limit. In fact, that limit was completely ignored, and these people were referred to as indentured servants. They were even told that they had a contract of indenture, but in fact they were slaves for life. Now, the way this occurred, the real engine of this enslavement in Britain was kidnapping. And again, if we go to our study of words, we find out that the origin of the word kidnapping, which is now a universal term for anyone who steals people, relates to white slavery. If you go to the old dictionaries, you'll find out that the original word was kidnabbing, N-A-B-B-I-N-G, and it's a specific reference to stealing white children and white adults for servitude in colonial America. And tens of thousands of them were kidnapped from the port cities of England and Scotland. In fact, it got so bad in the late 17th century that parents were in great fear to let their children go to the port cities on an errand without their parents or some other adult guardian safeguarding them. And in fact, even if an adult was along, oftentimes that adult would be knocked on the head and put on board the ship. And in my book, They Were White and They Were Slaves, I give many accounts of this mass kidnapping in action. So that was the principal means by which whites were brought to America as slaves. A secondary means was to trick them into the idea that they were going to have a limited contract of indenture for 7 years. But then when they came to America, you see, there was a way to lengthen that 7 years and to violate the biblical injunction against servitude going beyond 7 years. The way that happened was to create a roster of petty offenses. For example, if a white slave was away from his work or away from the plantation for more than a day or even for more than an hour, if the overseer decided that this was an arbitrary absence, they would add on a month of servitude to the white slave's time of service. And through various stratagems and tricks, this adding on went to the point where the people ended up being enslaved for life. And that's the real reality of bondage of whites in America. It's white slavery and not largely indentured servitude.
It's an amazing story, and ladies and gentlemen, this amazing story is told in Mr. Hoffman's book, They Were White and They Were Slaves, The Untold History of the Enslavement of Whites in Early America. Truth of the matter is, whites were the first slaves in America, not blacks, and that the media is not telling you. Let's go back to the book. Were there white children who were made slaves? How about white women also?
Yes, very definitely. If you were born to a white woman, then you also became the property of the owner. Now, for a white woman was basically banned. A white slave woman could not be married. And, of course, the slave masters realized that these women were going to exercise this function of nature, that it would be unnatural for them to suppress their procreative urge. And there were secret marriages, of course, by the score between white slave males and white slave females. But this played right into the hands of their owners because then more time was added on to their allegedly limited service by the fact that she had these children out of wedlock. Then the children became the property of the master. Now, it depended on which era of colonial law this occurred in. The law became more liberal in the 18th century. In the early 18th century, a child born to a white woman who was enslaved would be the slave of the master if it was a female till she was 18, if it was a male until he was 21. However, in the 17th century, when things were much rougher, their enslavement could go as long as until the age of 31. So this was really dependent on the local situation in the various states. It dates back to an old Roman slave code which decreed partus sequitur ventrum. The condition of the child follows the condition of the mother. So you see, this was really a slave law which we've seen all these heart-rendering Hollywood movies and on Ted Turner's TNT channel and so forth. But what they never tell us is this was first the experience of white people in bondage and only later the experience of some black people in bondage. So yes, white families suffered tremendously under white slavery in colonial America, you bet. Right.
So what you're saying then, Michael, is that virtually every component of what we've come to know as black slavery was first experienced by whites when they were enslaved here in America.
Absolutely. That's absolutely correct. From the fugitive slave law, where whites had a price on their head and were hunted and nearly whipped to death, and in some cases the whippings were actually fatal, to the auctioning of white slaves. As soon as they came off ships, they were taken like cattle, and their arms were felt and their teeth were examined and so forth. And this has been tremendously suppressed. And people can say, well, you know, if this actually happened, why haven't I heard about it? Well, for those of us who are a little bit sophisticated about history, we know that history is rigged and that many historians owe their jobs to how well they play with the party line. But there's also another aspect at work here, and that is the fact that in the late 18th, century and throughout the 19th century and even in the early 20th century, because this bondage extends right up into the 20th century, white people were very ashamed if they had a background of servitude. Many of those whites ended up settling in Appalachia. They became very alienated from the mainstream of the United States, and they were ashamed of their background. There was no one to come along and champion their cause here. They saw it as a kind of a stigma. Secondly, the aristocracy that had perpetrated this Holocaust against their own kin realized that they committed a great crime, both in the eyes of sacred scripture and in the eyes of common law. And so it was in their interest to cover this up as much as possible. So it's mostly fallen to me to be the one to dig this back up again and bring it to the attention of all people, black and white, so that we can deal with it and so that other researchers and historians can further explore it, because it's a pioneering field and there's a lot of room here for further discussion and investigation.
Where did you start going to find this material? Of course, you've got an excellent bibliography in the back, so I shouldn't ask you that, but why don't you tell the people?
Well, I live here in upstate New York, and believe it or not, New York is not entirely comprised of Manhattan. In fact, we have tried to break off the state. We've tried to make Manhattan the 51st state and make upstate New York, which is largely rural and farms, its own republic. So I'm in a very rural area, and the history here is very rich. Revolutionary War battles were fought, especially the Indian Wars of the American Revolution, with Generals Clinton and Sullivan fighting the Iroquois. And also I'm quite near to New England. In fact, when I originally became interested in this story, it was by researching Matthew Lyon, who is one of the American Revolutionary War heroes. He was a hero of the Battle of Bennington, Vermont. The famous commander of that, of course, was Ethan Allen. But as I began to dig into Matthew Lyon's story, I discovered that Matthew Lyon was a white slave. He became a very great American politician and a congressman, and in fact, he was imprisoned in a famous sedition case after the Americans won their freedom. He was imprisoned by the Federalists, but he became a great and accomplished man. He wrote a book, and he referred to himself as "by the bulls that redeemed me." Apparently, Matthew Lyon had been sold in return for a couple of deer, a couple of male deer. And, I mean, that was the status of white people in the 18th century in America. And so I couldn't find his grave, and later on I found out that he wasn't buried in New England at all, but he went down much later in his career after his wife died to the Kentucky-Tennessee area, where he made a name for himself in business. I did locate the grave of his wife, but as I discovered this, I was quite shocked that here was a great Revolutionary War hero whose life as a young man, he was an immigrant from Ireland, was worth no more than two male stags. And from there I began digging into diaries and documents and early colonial laws and piecing this together. And I also found that historians in their published works have parts of the story, but they're basically too pusillanimous to refer to it for what it is. There's a real problem among historians. They refuse to refer to whites as slaves. It's almost a phobia on their part. You can trace a great deal of their research leading inevitably, pointing in the direction of the fact that whites were slaves, but for reasons of political correctness, they can't bring themselves to use that word. So the footsteps and the tracks of this great mystery can be ferreted out in a number of areas, both in terms of original research, diaries, and letters, as well as in published histories.
Shalom, fam. So one of the things that I wanted to point out, a couple things actually, that I want to touch on here that I think very, very important. In the video, there was an image that he had shown that I thought was really interesting, and in that, in the image, I've seen the image before, and I'm sure you've seen it as well. When I show it to you, you'll remember. Um, so I want to show you that because I thought it was really, really important. So this is the image that he showed in that video. Now, you've seen that image before. I know you all have. So this, in fact, looks like the original image. All right, and notice the image that you're seeing here is not a brown person, not an indigenous person, but rather a so-called white person. All right, but you've seen this image before. So here's the image that they like to show you that you've seen. Okay, so this is the image that they typically show you that, again, this is the propaganda that perpetuates the narrative of an African slave. So the whole African transatlantic slave trade narrative. But it's based on the original picture here of the real slave trade, which was the the white slave, so-called white slave trade. All right, so again, this was the original image that we've never seen before, right? Most of us haven't seen this image because they typically show you this propaganda. Now, this is the propaganda of the so-called, the African slave trade. All right, the enslaved African, that they want to perpetuate that image. Now, why is that important to them? Is that they're well aware that images is part of, it's a psyop, that images are the best form of programming, and that's why they're constantly pushing these the fake fantasy slavery films that always are showing indigenous people as slaves, through the African transatlantic slave trade. That's why they show you all those fantasy films, because they're well aware that those images kind of permeate, right? So that is why they're constantly pushing the slave trade narrative through their films, their propaganda, their books, the media. But that obviously isn't the real story. All right. So, but I want to show you that this is the propaganda, but it's based on what? This original picture that you won't see in schools. They're not going to show and teach your kids the real truth and who the real slaves were. All right, so I thought that was really important. So one of the other things I wanted to touch on was he mentioned in the interview the word pauper. Now that's really important here. So what I want to show you is why that's important. That's important because there were different words, or there were several different words that were mentioned that described slaves, and in particular white slaves in the colonial period. And some of those words, I'm just going to read it here really quick here. So it says, many different types of white people that were enslaved on the European continent under feudalism. There were various forms of status applying to the people, such as serfs, villains, vagabond, and slave. All right, so I'm going to read that again. Many different types of white people were enslaved on the European continent under feudalism. There were various forms of status applying to the people, such as serf, villain, vagabond, and slave, who were indentured or forced to labor without pay. So why that's really important, these words. So there were other words also that were applied to so-called white slaves. So notice the word villain here. I thought was very interesting. You've seen that word villain typically with an A, and it's usually it depicts a negative person or a negative image. I guess let's say the opposite of a hero, right? So but originally it was referred to as a slave. All right. So vagabond is also another word that they use as a slave, a white slave. Serf, we're well aware that's what they referred to originally. That was part of feudalism, serfs or servants. Now, another word is pauper, that they refer to as white slaves, and rednecks, redlegs, and as well as squatters. So these were all words that they used to refer to white slaves, slaves, period, which were typically, again, slaves were white people. So during the colonial period, and see, this is what they have been hiding for a very long time. The truth of what the actual transatlantic slave trade really was, the real slave trade. So at any rate, why this is really relative, these words that apply to slaves, the villain, the vagabond, and serf, and so on, is because um, so our original Constitution that was originally referred to as the Articles of Confederation um, was the whole idea. Again, the Articles of Confederation was established by the Continental Congress, and that was the original Constitution of the Founding Fathers. And that's what the so-called Constitution today, the de facto Constitution, is based on. So they say there's actually a couple different versions of the United States of America Constitution that they refer to as the U.S. Constitution. I've heard as many as 3 or 4 different versions floating around. But let's just put it this way. The Constitution that they have posted on the Library of Congress' de facto website is not the original Constitution. That's why you won't see the actual real one up close. They only give it to you like a snapshot of it, a snippet of it, and then they give you a printed version of it, not the original version of it online. Because the original version is somewhere archived somewhere that you will not see online. So, at any rate, this is really important. This is a copy of the the Articles of Confederation, is because this is the relative constitution that was ratified in. Now, this was originally written, they said, right after the Declaration of Independence, around 1777, and ratified in, they say, 1781. And then they say the actual the Constitution today was ratified in, I think, 1789. But this is the original Constitution. Now, why this is really important, the Articles of Confederation, is because if you look at Article 4, and I'm just going to read it here, it says, and I'm going to move it around here so you can see it. It says, the better to secure and perpetuate mutual friendship and intercourse among the people of the different states in this union, the free inhabitants of each of these states, paupers, vagabonds, and fugitives from justice excepted, shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of free citizens in the several states. Now I'm going to repeat that again. And some of it's cut off on the right hand side, so I'll just read through it rather than move it back and forth here. It says, the better to secure and perpetuate mutual friendship and intercourse among the people of the different states in this union, the free inhabitants of each of these states, paupers, vagabonds, and fugitives from justice excepted, shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of free citizens in the several states. So what that essentially means is that in this Constitution, that paupers, vagabonds, and fugitives, these all of these people were considered slaves, paupers and vagabonds. All right, and if you recall in the video, and you can play it back, the guy mentions paupers. White slaves were considered paupers. They were also referred to as paupers. So these were the slaves, paupers as well as vagabonds. They were considered slaves. So if they were the slaves, white people in the colonial period were the slaves. The Africans, the African slave, the so-called African slave trade, there really wasn't. I mean, the Africans that they brought over, very few were either prisoners of war, or they were, you're well familiar with the Moorish Sundry Act of 1790. If not, look it up. But they were either brought over as prisoners of war, some indentured servants, but they were a microcosm of the slave trade. The majority of the slaves, all right, that were brought here were foreigners. They were whites. They were white people to work the plantations. All right? And they're well aware this is factual. That's why there have been countless books written on all this. White Cargo. I think there's one called White Captives in the Barbary States. There's so many books that have been written on all of this. Really doesn't take that much to research. But the thing about those books, just keep in mind when you read them, if you've read any, you have to you've got to sift through and filter through all the clutter. Because whites, they tend to lie by omission. It's not what they tell you, it's what they don't tell you. And they wrote the books essentially to, obviously to, for profit, because controversy sells. But the point is that it's still relative information, but you're not going to get the whole truth out of them. They're not going to tell you the whole story. They're just going to tell it to you you get it in increments. They lie by omission. They'll omit something. They will admit some things, but they will omit the rest. They're not going to tell you the whole story. But I think the guy that did this video in this interview, he brought a lot of this, in a proper context, in terms of, now he didn't tell you all the truth either, especially when he was telling you the people that were brought here is to work the plantations from, like, rebellions, when they rebelled against the crown. Well, that's not entirely, because he was telling you they rebelled against the crown, against the white king. Well, he's well aware that there was no white king back in those days. He was referring to the Jacobite rebellion, and that would have been the people at that time from Scotland and Ireland, the British Isles, that were rebelling against the usurp of the throne of Charles I from Oliver Cromwell. And then what Cromwell did was he just deported them to the islands, the people that rebelled. So he's not telling you the whole story there, again, lying by omission, because he's well aware there was not a white king at that time. The people that were ruling in Britain were not white people. So it helps you to comprehend and put all this in the proper context, that no, indigenous people, for the most part, our people at that time that were ruling, we did not enslave our own people. So yes, it was a white slave trade. That is the slave trade. Now this is what they have hidden. It's what they will not teach in the schools, and that's the truth of what the real slave trade was in the colonial era. So at any rate, I thought this was some very important information. And why this is so important is that if the paupers and the vagabonds were not considered, they were not considered citizens, then that means that these were the whites. They weren't citizens, so they were slaves. And now you comprehend why they made some changes to the Constitution. But they wanted indigenous people to think that when they were referring to who the slaves were in the Constitution, everything pertaining to a slave had everything to do with an indigenous person. Well, clearly, if you look at the Articles of Confederation, it really actually sheds a lot more, um, a lot more clarity on the truth and the truth of the matter based on the people who were ruling at those, ruling in that era, during those times, that wouldn't even really make sense. That it was referring to the people that were a large majority of who the slaves were, and it had really very little to do with the indigenous people. It actually had to do with who the paupers and vagabonds were, and those were at that time the white slaves, so-called white people. And it actually brings into a completely different perspective what the Confederate flag really represented. Now, I want you to think about that, because what you think the Confederate flag, I know, look, I get it. Some of our people think, oh, well, they had to do with rednecks and all that. Well, the rednecks were the slaves. That was another word for slaves, for white people that were working the plantations in the West Indies. And, because the sun down there, it would be so hot that they would burn. So people would tease them, and the people on the plantation would call them rednecks. So yeah. I know you think that the whole Confederate thing had to do with Africans and all of that and slavery. That's why I get it. So many people do not like the Confederate flag, but that it was not what the original Confederate flag really represented. It had really nothing to do with that. It had everything to do with Great Britain. So that's just something to think about. So thank you for tuning in. I'm actually going to do a second, I would like to do a second part to this video, because I think I would like to continue, to keep the conversation going. So yeah, I'll be doing that relatively soon, probably in a couple of weeks, because there's some other subject matter I'd like to continue to pick up on. But at any rate, thank you for tuning in. Please share and subscribe. And if anyone can think of that book that actually mentions white people they use the word Negro. And by the way, here's another thing. The word Negro and gringo are relatively, they're the same word. Gringo is just an anagram. It's an anagrammatic form of the word Negro. And they even sound the same. All they did was add an extra G to the word gringo. And this is what Mexicans tend to call white people. Either white people, or it means white or foreigners. I think foreigners they say, but I think it means both anyway. But what's interesting is that is the same word. It's wordplay for Negro. But there's a book that indicates actually white people. It mentions in the book that white people were also back in colonial period referred to as Negroes, and I think even also as the B word. So if anyone can remember the name of that book, please share that as well. So at any rate, thank you so much for tuning in, and may the Most High continue to prosper and awaken the Shemitic mind within. Shalom.